particularly bad attack of aches and pains prevented Sophie from setting out for market chipping that evening. She lay in her cubbyhole and ached and worried about Martha. It mightn't be so bad, she thought. She only had to say that the suitor Martha wasn't sure about was none other than Wizard Howl. That would scare her off. And she'd tell Martha that the way to scare Howl off was to announce that she was in love with him. Sophie was still creaking when she got up next morning. "Curse the witch of the waste," she muttered to her stick as she got it out, ready to leave. She could hear Howl singing in the bathroom, as if he'd never had a tantrum in his life. She tiptoed to the front door as fast as she could hobble. Howl, of course, came out of the bathroom before she reached it. He was all spruce and dashing, scented gently with apple blossom. The sunlight from the window dazzled off his grey and scarlet suit and made a faintly pink halo of his hair. "I think my hair looks rather good this colour," he said. "Do you indeed?" grumped Sophie. "It goes with this suit," said Howl. "You have quite a touch with your needle, don't you? You've given the suit more style somehow." "Huh," said Sophie. Howl laughed as he turned the knob to red down. "I apologise. Now the king wants to see me today. When Michael gets back, don't forget to tell him I left that spell for him on the bench." He smiled sunnily at Sophie and stepped out among the spires of Kingsbury. A few minutes later, the door sprang open and Michael burst jubilantly in. He dumped a loaf, a pie and a pink and white striped box on the table. Then he seized Sophie round her skinny waist and danced her round the room. "It's all right," he shouted. Sophie hopped and stumbled to keep out of the way of Michael's boots. "Steady," she gasped. "What's all right?" "Lettie loves me." Michael danced her almost into the hearth. "She's never even seen Howl. It was all a mistake." He whirled Sophie to the chair and dumped her into it. "Last night when Howl said, 'Lettie Hatter,' I knew that as soon as he'd got her to love him, he was going to drop this girl just like all the others. And when I thought it was my Lettie, I was distraught. Anyway, I tore down to market chipping early today, and it's all right. Howl must be after some other girl with the same name. Lettie's never even seen him." "Let's get this straight," said Sophie. "We're talking about the Lettie Hatter who works in Cesare's pastry shop, are we?" "Of course we are," said Michael. "I've loved her ever since she started work there, and I almost couldn't believe it when she said she loved me. She has hundreds of admirers. I wouldn't have been surprised if Howl was one of them. I'm so relieved. I got you a cake from Cesare's to celebrate. Where did I put it? Oh, here it is." He thrust the pink and white box at Sophie. "How old are you, my child?" said Sophie. 15 last May Day," said Michael. "You're probably thinking I'm too young to be engaged. I've still got 3 years of my apprenticeship to run, and Lettie's got even longer. But we promised one another, and we don't mind waiting." Then Michael was about the right age for Martha, thought Sophie, and she knew by now he was a nice, steady lad with a career as a wizard ahead of him. Bless Martha's heart. "Your Lettie," said Sophie, "is my sister's granddaughter." "Really?" said Michael. "Well, I described Howl and she's never set eyes on him." "That's a relief," said Sophie. But not much of one, she thought, because the only other Lettie Hatter in the district must be the real one, and she'd told Howl her name. She seemed to like him enough to trust him with an important secret like that. The square knob over the door clicked round to red blob down, and Howl came in. "What a marvellous cake! Where did you get it?" I called in at Cesare's," said Michael. "Never been there," said Howl. "It looks worth the walk," he said, inspecting the cake. "You know, every time I do something for the king, he wants more. Today he wanted me to volunteer to look for his brother. I'm not going to." "Why?" said Sophie. "Don't you think you can find him?" "The problem is I know I can find him. Prince Justin was great buddies with Wizard Suleiman and told the king he was going to look for him. He didn't think the king should have sent Suleiman to the Waste. Now, even you must know there's a certain lady in the Waste who's very bad news. Last year she sent a curse out after me that I've only avoided so far because I'd had the sense to give it a false name." Sophie was almost awed. "You mean you jilted the Witch of the Waste?" Michael said, "Do you think we should move the castle?" Howl looked over his shoulder at Calcifer. "That depends on him. I must say, if I think of the king and the witch, both after me, I get a craving for planting the castle 1,000 miles away." Michael obviously wished he hadn't spoken. Sophie could see he was thinking that 1,000 miles was a terribly long way from Martha. This, she thought, was where she slithered out. She had had enough of Howl. Tomorrow she'd slip off to Upper Folding and tell Lettie all about it. Next morning Howl left the castle early. Shortly afterwards Sophie managed to get out without being seen by Michael, but she hadn't gone far when he came bounding down the hillside after her. The tall black castle came bobbling along behind him. "What are you doing?" he said. "Going to see my other sister's granddaughter. She's called Lettie Hatter too." "Where does she live?" "Upper Folding," said Sophie, "with a Mrs. Fairfax." "But Upper Folding's over 10 miles away. Besides, Howl must have gone there too." "I'm quite sure he has." "I simply can't let you go," said Michael. "You ought to rest." Sophie was almost ready to hit him. "Wait," he said. "There's a pair of 7-league boots in the broom cupboard." He took Sophie by her skinny old wrist and towed her uphill to the waiting castle. "But 7 leagues is 21 miles, she panted. "I'd be halfway to Porthaven in 2 strides." "No, each step of the boots is 10.5 miles. We'll each take 1 boot and go together." Michael fetched the boots from the broom cupboard. They sat on the doorstep and each put 1 foot in a boot. "Now," he said, "point yourself towards Upper Folding before you put the boot down." He and Sophie stood up and carefully swung themselves round to face Upper Folding. "Now," said Michael, "tread." Zip! The landscape rushed past them so fast it was only a blur. The wind of their going tore at Sophie's hair and dragged every wrinkle in her face backwards. Unfortunately, as Sophie landed, the bucket-like boot was so heavy that she staggered. "Don't put that foot down!" yelled Michael. Too late. There was another zipping blur and more rushing wind. When it stopped, Sophie found herself right down the folding valley. "Drat!" she said, and hopped carefully round. Zip! Blur! She was back on Upper Folding Green again. This time she sat down with a thump. Michael sprinted up before Sophie could move and dragged the boot off. He hid the boots in the hedge. Sophie's heart pounded as they walked across the common to Mrs. Fairfax's house.